Welcome back to History Bedtime Stories, the channel where we explore the most fascinating tales from humanity's past. I'm your host, and tonight, we're journeying back 8 centuries to the vast, windswept steppes of Mongolia. We're going to tell you the extraordinary story of a boy, a lost, forgotten boy who would go on to become the most powerful man in human history. His name was Temüjin, and he would eventually become known as Genghis Khan. This isn't just a story about conquest and power. This is a story about resilience, intelligence, and an almost supernatural ability to transform tragedy into triumph. It's a story that will take us from the harsh winters of medieval Mongolia to the glittering courts of China, from intimate family betrayals to the creation of an empire so vast that it stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let's travel back in time to meet a boy who lost everything and then conquered the world. Before we meet our protagonist, we need to understand the world he was born into. Imagine, if you will, a landscape stretching endlessly in every direction. No cities, no roads, no civilization as we think of it in the medieval world. Instead, vast grasslands, the steppes of Mongolia, where temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees below zero in winter, and summer brought dust storms so fierce they could blind a man. The Mongol people didn't build cities or establish permanent settlements. They were nomadic, moving constantly with their herds of horses, sheep, and yaks. Life was harsh, unforgiving, and brutally short. A single mistake, a miscalculation about water supplies, an illness, a harsh winter, could mean death for an entire family. The year was 1162. In Europe, knights were riding to the Crusades. In China, the Jin dynasty ruled with an iron fist. But in Mongolia, there was no unified nation. Instead, the Mongol tribes were fragmented into dozens of competing clans, each one fiercely independent, each one ready to wage war against their neighbors over grazing lands, horses, and honor. Blood feuds lasted for generations. Revenge was a way of life. Trust was something you gave only to your immediate family, and sometimes not even then. Into this world of chaos and violence, a child was born. His father was a man named Yasujii, a minor chieftain of the Kiat clan. Yasujii wasn't particularly powerful or wealthy by Mongol standards, but he was clever, ambitious, and ruthless, traits that would serve him well in the cutthroat politics of the steppes. Yasujii had just won a great victory. He had defeated a rival Tatar chieftain named Temüjin in battle. To commemorate this victory and perhaps to make some kind of peace, Yasujii decided to marry a woman from another tribe, a woman named Hoelin, who was betrothed to a Tatar nobleman named Yoko. Yasujii's men ambushed the wedding procession, took Hoelin by force, and brought her to Yasujii's camp. Now, by modern standards, this was kidnapping and a violation of the deepest kind. But in the Mongolia of the 12th century, this was simply how things were done. The strong took what they wanted, and the weak had little recourse but to accept their fate. Hoelin became Yasujii's wife, and within a year, she gave birth to a son. The boy was named Temüjin, named after the Tatar chief that Yasujii had defeated just before the boy was born. In Mongol culture, naming a child after a defeated enemy was a way of honoring that enemy's strength and absorbing his power into the family line. It was also, perhaps, a way of showing dominance, of saying, "I defeated your namesake, and now I have a son who bears his name." From the moment of his birth, Temüjin was marked by the circumstances of his conception. His mother was taken by force. His name commemorated a defeat and a conquest. His very existence was a symbol of his father's power and ambition. Yet, There was something else in young Temüjin's nature, something that would eventually transform him into one of history's most remarkable figures. As an infant, Temüjin showed an unusual intensity and intelligence. Those who knew him said he had penetrating eyes that seemed to look beyond the present moment into some distant future. His grip was firm. His cry was strong. These might seem like small details, but to the Mongols, who read meaning in every sign of nature, they were portents. This child would be different. This child would be great. Yasujii was pleased with his son. He spent time teaching the boy the ways of the steppes, how to ride a horse, how to shoot with a bow, how to survive in the harsh environment that was their home. But Yasujii had made many enemies in his rise to power, and those enemies were watching, waiting for their chance at revenge. When Temüjin was around 9 years old, his father Yasujii was poisoned by members of the Tatar tribe, the same tribe whose chief had been defeated before Temüjin's birth. It was an act of revenge carried out in secret, but the message was clear. The Tatars had not forgotten, and they would have their vengeance. Yasujii died slowly and painfully, and when he did, everything changed for young Temüjin. His father had been a leader, a man with influence and power. When Yasujii was alive, his clan members respected him and followed him. But in the Mongol world, loyalty was tied directly to power and success. Without Yasujii to lead them, the clan began to fracture. Many of the families who had been part of Yasujii's clan abandoned Hoelin and her children. They drifted away to join other, more powerful chieftains. Some left under cover of night. Others simply announced that they were departing and that they would no longer recognize Hoelin's authority. Within months, Hoelin and her children, Temüjin and his younger siblings, found themselves alone on the steppes with almost nothing. They had a few horses, some basic supplies, and the clothes on their backs. What they didn't have was protection, status, or the support of a larger clan. In the world of the Mongol steppes, this made them incredibly vulnerable. Hoelin was a resourceful woman. She had already survived abduction, forced marriage, and the death of her husband. Now, she used all her intelligence and strength to keep her family alive. She taught her children how to forage for food, how to survive on the steppes, and crucially, how to maintain their dignity and pride despite their reduced circumstances. Temüjin, at this young age, began to develop the characteristics that would later define him. He was observant, learning quickly from his mother's example. He was fiercely protective of his family, even as a child. And he was consumed by a burning desire to restore his family's honor and to avenge his father's death. But survival came first. The years after Yasujii's death were terrifyingly difficult. The family lived hand to mouth, foraging in the spring and summer, struggling to find enough food in the brutal winters. There were nights when they went hungry. There were seasons when they weren't sure if they would survive to see spring. It was during this period of hardship that Temüjin's character was truly forged. Children raised in comfort often develop a sense of entitlement and weakness. But children who survive genuine hardship, who face hunger, cold, and danger and overcome them, develop a kind of inner steel. Temüjin learned that survival depended not on brute strength alone, but on intelligence, creativity, and the ability to read the intentions and desires of others. As Temüjin entered his teenage years, his family's situation began to change. Slowly, some of the families who had abandoned them began to drift back. Word had spread about the young man's intelligence and his fierce dedication to his family. Some people began to see in him the potential that his father had possessed. Others simply remembered that his father had been a capable warrior, and they wondered if the son might develop similar skills. When Temüjin was about 16 years old, he had his first recorded act of revenge. One of the men who had been involved in his father's death was a Tatar warrior. Temüjin managed to confront this man, and in a confrontation that likely involved both combat and cunning, Temüjin killed him. It was a symbolic act, a way of announcing that he was no longer the helpless child whose family had been destroyed, but a young man capable of avenging his own honor. But around this same time, Temüjin experienced another tragedy that would test him even more severely. A rival clan, the Tatars, launched a raid on Temüjin's encampment. In the chaos and violence of the attack, Temüjin was captured. For a young man of his status and background, capture was an almost unimaginable humiliation. He was bound and taken prisoner, a slave in the eyes of his captors. Temüjin was held in captivity, and as a young prisoner of the Tatars, he was subjected to every indignity. He was forced to serve his captors, given minimal food, and treated as property rather than as a human being. For many people, such an experience would have broken their spirit entirely. But Temüjin used this time to observe, to learn, and to plan. Living among the Tatars as a prisoner, he learned their language, their customs, and their way of thinking. He observed which Tatar warriors were strong and which were weak. He learned which guards could be bribed or manipulated, and which ones would remain loyal to their masters no matter what. Most importantly, he learned that the Tatars, despite their military power, were not invincible or all-wise. They were simply men with weaknesses, fears, and desires that could be exploited. After months of captivity, Temüjin made his escape. The exact details of his escape have been lost to history, but the record indicates that he managed to slip away from his captors and make his way back to his family. The escape itself became legendary. A young man, a prisoner, alone and hunted, surviving in the wilderness and finding his way home. It was the kind of story that inspired people and made them believe that perhaps this young man was destined for something great. By the time Temüjin was in his late teenage years, the pieces of his early life had formed a pattern. He had experienced loss and humiliation. He had known hunger and danger. He had survived capture and escaped when others might have simply given up. He had avenged his father's death. And through it all, he had developed an almost preternatural understanding of how to navigate the complex social and political landscape of Mongol society. Around this same time, Temüjin married. His wife was a woman named Borte, and their marriage was politically significant because Borte was the daughter of a friendly chieftain, which helped solidify alliances between their families. By marrying Borte, Temüjin was beginning to rebuild his family's social position and create networks of loyalty and obligation that would serve him well in the future. But the Mongol steppes were a place where fortune could change in an instant, and Temüjin was about to learn this lesson in the most devastating way possible. Shortly after his marriage to Borte, while Temüjin was away from their encampment, the Merkits, yet another rival clan, launched a raid. They had their own reasons for wanting revenge against Temüjin's family. In the raid, they kidnapped Borte, taking her with them as a prize of war. Borte's kidnapping was a catastrophe. For a Mongol warrior, having his wife taken by enemies was one of the deepest possible humiliations. It wasn't just a personal loss. It was a challenge to his honor and his standing in society. At that moment, Temüjin faced a choice. He could accept the loss and attempt to move forward, or he could do whatever it took to get his wife back. Temüjin chose the latter path. He made his way to the camp of a powerful chieftain named Genghis Khan, who had been a friend of his father's. Temüjin didn't come as a petitioner or a supplicant. Instead, he came with a proposition. If Genghis Khan would help him defeat the Merkits and retrieve his wife, Temüjin would pledge his loyalty and his service to Togrul Khan. It was a calculated political move, but it was also a genuine offer of allegiance. Togrul Khan was impressed by the young man's boldness and cunning. More than that, he saw in Temüjin a kindred spirit, someone who understood that power came not from birthright alone, but from intelligence, courage, and the ability to forge alliances. Togrul Khan agreed to help Temüjin, and together with another powerful ally named Jamukha, they launched a military campaign against the Merkits. The campaign was a success. Temüjin and his allies defeated the Merkits in battle, and Borte was retrieved. She returned to Temüjin's camp, but there was tragedy within the victory. Borte had been pregnant when she was kidnapped, and she gave birth to a son shortly after her return. The child was named Joki, and questions immediately arose about whether Joki was truly Temüjin's biological son or the son of a Merkit warrior. In a society where legitimacy and bloodline were everything, this uncertainty was damaging to both Borte's reputation and to Joki's future standing. Temüjin, however, chose to accept Joki as his son and to raise him as a member of his family. This decision reveals something crucial about Temüjin's character. He was pragmatic enough to see beyond the conventional dishonor of the situation. He understood that by publicly accepting Joki, he was sending a message that he valued his wife's safety more than he valued his own pride. This kind of emotional maturity and strategic thinking would become hallmarks of his leadership. By his mid-20s, Temüjin had survived abandonment, poverty, capture, and humiliation. He had avenged his father's death. He had successfully retrieved his wife despite overwhelming odds. And he had begun to develop a network of powerful allies, most notably Togrul Khan and Jamukha. In Mongol society, these accomplishments made him a notable figure, but they did not make him a great one. Great leaders needed more than courage and cunning. They needed vision, the ability to unite people with wildly different interests, and an almost supernatural charisma that could inspire devotion in their followers. The next phase of Temüjin's rise would require him to do something that no one before him had successfully accomplished: unite the fractured tribes of Mongolia under a single banner. It was a task that had seemed impossible for centuries. The Mongol tribes were too independent, too proud, too devoted to their own interests and their own feuds. But Temüjin was beginning to understand something that others had missed: that unity didn't have to come from a shared culture or a shared history. It could come from shared advantage, from the promise of wealth and success, and from the fear of those who opposed him. Between roughly 1180 and 1206, Temüjin spent more than 20 years conquering, alliance building, manipulating, and sometimes brutally eliminating rival Mongol tribes and clans. This wasn't a straightforward military campaign. It was a complex political and military chess game played across the steppes, with lives and fortunes at stake. Temüjin employed several key strategies during this period. First, he was extraordinarily generous with his followers. When he won victories, he distributed the spoils, horses, weapons, treasure, among those who had fought for him. This was unusual in Mongol culture, where leaders typically kept the lion's share for themselves. But Temüjin understood that generosity created loyalty, and loyalty was more valuable than any amount of gold. Second, he was ruthlessly efficient in eliminating threats. When a rival leader refused to submit to his authority, Temüjin didn't simply defeat them in battle and then allow them to retreat and regroup. He systematically destroyed them. He killed rival leaders and their families. He scattered their clans. He eliminated the possibility of future rebellion through a combination of military force and psychological terror. To modern ears, this sounds brutal and inhumane, and it was. But in the context of 12th century Mongolia, Where tribal warfare was constant and merciful, it was often devastating to your enemies. Temüjin's approach was logical and effective. Third, Temüjin was a master of understanding and manipulating human nature. He recruited talented individuals to his cause, regardless of their tribal origin or their previous loyalty to other leaders. If a warrior showed promise, Temüjin would find a way to bring him into his service. If a craftsman had valuable skills, Temüjin would offer him wealth and status in exchange for his expertise. He built around himself a cadre of talented, ambitious individuals who saw in him the promise of power and success. One of his most important early allies was a man named Nyan. Nyan was a shaman, a spiritual leader who held great influence among the Mongol people. By winning Nyan's support and blessing, Temüjin was able to claim that his rise to power had divine sanction. The Mongols believed in a god called Tengri, the eternal blue sky, and shamans were believed to have special access to Tengri's will. When Nyan proclaimed that Tengri had chosen Temüjin to rule, it was a powerful statement of legitimacy. Another crucial ally was a man named Jamukha, the same Jamukha who had helped Temüjin retrieve his wife Borte from the Merkits. Initially, Jamukha and Temüjin were friends and equals, each commanding his own confederation of tribes. But as Temüjin's power grew, the relationship between the two men became increasingly strained. Jamukha was also ambitious, and he saw Temüjin's growing power as a threat to his own position. Eventually, the friendship curdled into rivalry, and then into open hostility. The conflict between Temüjin and Jamukha came to a head around 1201, nearly 2 decades into Temüjin's campaign of unification. The two men led their respective confederations into battle on the Onan River. The battle was fierce and costly, but Temüjin's forces emerged victorious. Jamukha was defeated, but he managed to escape with some of his followers. Rather than pursuing Jamukha immediately, Temüjin turned his attention to consolidating his power. He reorganized his forces into a more structured military system, dividing his army into units of 1,000 men, with subordinate commanders reporting to him. He established a meritocratic system in which warriors could advance based on their abilities and loyalty rather than solely on their tribal origin or family connections. These reforms made his army far more effective and cohesive than the loose coalitions of tribes that typically opposed him. Over the next few years, Temüjin continued his campaign of unification. He defeated the Tatars, the people who had poisoned his father and had held him captive as a youth. He defeated the Karaite tribe, bringing them under his authority. He defeated the Merkits, who had kidnapped his wife. One by one, the independent Mongol tribes either submitted to his rule or were destroyed. Jamukha, meanwhile, continued to resist. He led his own confederation of tribes against Temüjin, and for several years the two men waged a prolonged conflict across the steppes. But Jamukha was fighting a losing battle. With each conflict, more tribes defected from Jamukha to Temüjin, drawn by the promise of success and the fear of backing a losing cause. Jamukha's confederation grew weaker while Temüjin's grew stronger. Finally, around 1204, Jamukha's forces were decisively defeated. Some sources say that Jamukha was killed in battle. Others say that he was captured and executed on Temüjin's orders. Regardless of the exact circumstances, Jamukha's defeat marked the end of the last serious internal challenge to Temüjin's authority. For the first time in Mongol history, a single leader had unified all the major Mongol tribes under his rule. But victory on the battlefield was not the same as true political consolidation. The defeated tribes still harbored resentments and desires for independence. Former rivals still questioned Temüjin's right to rule. The Mongol people themselves had no tradition of centralized authority. They had always been divided into independent clans and tribes, each one fiercely protective of its autonomy. Creating a unified nation out of these fractious people would require more than military victory. It would require a fundamental reimagining of Mongol identity and Mongol society. In 1206, at a grand assembly called a Kurultai, the Mongol tribes formally recognized Temüjin as their supreme leader. This Kurultai took place on the banks of the Onan River, the river where Temüjin had been born nearly 50 years earlier. It was a symbolic homecoming of sorts. The boy who had been abandoned and stripped of everything was now the master of all the Mongol peoples. At this Kurultai, Temüjin was given a new title, Genghis Khan. The exact meaning of Genghis Khan has been debated by scholars, but the most likely translation is universal ruler or ruler of all people. It was a title that reflected Temüjin's ambition and his belief that he was destined to rule not just the Mongols, but all the peoples of the world. Genghis Khan was not a young man when he achieved this supreme position. He was in his mid-40s, an age at which many men think about retirement and reflection rather than conquest. But Genghis Khan was just beginning. Everything that had come before, the years of poverty and hardship, the defeats and humiliations, the slow process of unifying the Mongol tribes, all of it had been a prelude to the main act. Now, as the supreme ruler of the Mongol peoples, Genghis Khan was ready to embark on the greatest military campaign the world had ever seen. His first target was the Jin dynasty of China. The Jin dynasty ruled northern China with a vast military and economic apparatus. The Jins had long looked down on the Mongols as barbaric outsiders, and they had sometimes raided Mongol territory or attempted to manipulate Mongol tribes against each other. Genghis Khan decided that it was time to teach the Jin dynasty a lesson. In 1205, even before his official proclamation as Genghis Khan, he had begun military operations against Jin-affiliated territories. But the real campaign began after 1206, when Genghis Khan could devote the full resources of a unified Mongol nation to the conquest of China. The Jin dynasty was not without military capabilities. They had a large standing army, fortified cities, and centuries of military tradition. But they were also fragmented and complacent. The Jin court was rife with factionalism and corruption. The military leadership was often incompetent. And most importantly, they had never encountered anything like the Mongol military machine that Genghis Khan was building. Genghis Khan's military innovations were revolutionary. He created a cavalry army of unprecedented size and coordination. He introduced a logistics system that allowed his armies to move rapidly across vast distances while maintaining supply lines. He developed siege weaponry and techniques that allowed him to assault fortified cities. He implemented a command structure based on merit rather than nobility, meaning that the most competent commanders rose to the highest positions regardless of their social origin. The Mongol army was also extraordinarily brutal. When cities resisted, Genghis Khan would order their complete destruction, including the execution of all inhabitants. This served two purposes. It eliminated sources of resistance, and it sent a message to other cities that resistance was futile. Many cities, upon hearing the approach of the Mongol army, would surrender without a fight, knowing that the alternative was annihilation. Genghis Khan's campaign against the Jin dynasty lasted nearly 2 decades. It was not a swift or easy conquest. The Jin dynasty mounted a substantial resistance, and progress was often slow and costly. But gradually, methodically, Genghis Khan's armies conquered more and more Jin territory. Cities fell. Regions were subdued. By 1215, The Jin capital of Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, had fallen to the Mongols. The Jin dynasty was not completely destroyed at this point. It survived in a diminished form, ruling reduced territories from a new capital further south. But the message was clear. The Mongols were not a minor nuisance to be brushed aside. They were a major military power, and under Genghis Khan's leadership, they had the potential to reshape the entire political landscape of Asia. As Genghis Khan was consolidating his control over northern China, he was also turning his attention westward. In Central Asia, there was a vast Islamic empire called the Khwarezmian Empire, centered in what is now Uzbekistan and Iran. The Khwarezmian Shah was a powerful ruler, and he controlled crucial trade routes and considerable military resources. Around 1218, a Mongol merchant caravan was traveling through Khwarezmian territory when it was stopped and robbed by a local governor. The merchants were killed, and their goods were seized. It was a relatively minor incident in the grand scheme of things, but Genghis Khan took it as a personal affront. He decided that the Khwarezmian Empire had to be destroyed. What followed was one of the most destructive military campaigns in human history. Genghis Khan assembled an enormous army and sent it westward under the command of himself and his generals. The Mongol forces utterly devastated the Khwarezmian Empire. Cities were conquered and destroyed. The population was slaughtered. The Khwarezmian Shah himself was forced to flee before the advancing Mongol armies, eventually dying in exile on an island in the Caspian Sea. The conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire had far-reaching consequences. First, it eliminated a powerful rival to Mongol supremacy in Central Asia. Second, it opened up the Silk Road trade routes to Mongol control, meaning that Genghis Khan could now tax and profit from the lucrative trade between East and West. Third, it demonstrated to the Islamic world and the European powers beyond that the Mongols were a force to be reckoned with. Word spread quickly through Central Asia and into the Middle East and Eastern Europe that a fearsome Asian conqueror had emerged and was rapidly expanding his domain. Between roughly 1210 and 1227, when Genghis Khan died, his Mongol Empire expanded to cover an area larger than the continental United States. It stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, from Siberia in the north to Vietnam and southern China in the south. No single military force had ever conquered such a vast territory in such a short period of time. How was this possible? How did a boy born in poverty on the Mongol steppes manage to conquer a territory that would eventually stretch across 2 continents? The answer lies in a combination of military innovation, political intelligence, and the unique circumstances of the age. First, there was the factor of military technology. The Mongols were supreme horsemen and archers. Every Mongol warrior grew up riding horses and shooting bows, skills that were natural to them but had to be laboriously acquired by soldiers from settled societies like China and Persia. Mongol horses were hardy and could survive on minimal forage, making them ideally suited to the vast distances of Asian geography. Second, there was the factor of organization. Genghis Khan imposed a level of military discipline and coordination on the Mongol forces that had never been seen before. Every soldier knew his place in the hierarchy. Every unit knew its objectives and how to coordinate with other units. This made the Mongol army far more effective than the typical armies of the time, which were often loose collections of somewhat independent units that didn't necessarily coordinate well with each other. Third, there was the factor of brutality and psychological warfare. Genghis Khan understood that fear was a weapon just as potent as military force. The Mongols built a reputation for absolute ruthlessness. If a city resisted, it would be destroyed, and everyone in it would be killed. This was not a bluff. The Mongols had demonstrated this again and again. As a result, Many cities and regions would surrender without a fight, choosing submission over the certainty of destruction. Fourth, there was the factor of intelligence and innovation. Genghis Khan and his generals were constantly learning and adapting. When they encountered fortified cities in China, they realized they needed siege weapons. They studied the siege techniques used by Chinese armies and adapted them for Mongol use. When they encountered steppe peoples to the east, they incorporated the best warriors from those peoples into their armies. Genghis Khan was not a military genius who relied on a single brilliant strategy. Instead, he was an adaptive leader who was constantly evolving his tactics and his technology to meet new challenges. Finally, there was a factor of timing and geopolitical opportunity. The major civilizations of the era, China, Persia, Europe, were divided and often at war with each other. There was no united opposition to Mongol expansion. The Jin dynasty of China was weakened by internal factionalism. The Islamic kingdoms of Central Asia and Persia were divided among competing powers. Europe was fragmented into feudal states that could barely cooperate with each other. This disunity meant that Genghis Khan never had to face a united enemy. He could defeat his opponents one at a time, consolidating power and resources before moving on to the next target. Genghis Khan died in 1227, sometime during a campaign in western China. The exact cause of his death is unclear. Sources variously attribute it to an infected wound, disease, or internal bleeding. But by the time of his death, he had accomplished something that historians still struggle to fully comprehend. He had united the fractious Mongol tribes and built an empire that would last for more than a century after his death and would profoundly shape the course of world history. His empire was not the largest empire in terms of total area. The British Empire at its height was larger, but it was arguably the most impressive in terms of how quickly it was built and how thoroughly it transformed the societies it conquered. The Mongol invasions destroyed cities and killed millions of people, but they also created unprecedented connections between East and West. The Pax Mongolica, the period of relative peace and security under Mongol rule, allowed for the movement of goods, ideas, technologies, and people across Asia on a scale previously unknown. It was the Mongol Empire that eventually facilitated the journey of Marco Polo from Venice to the court of Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson. It was the Mongol conquest of Baghdad that marked the end of the Abbasid Caliphate and reshaped the Islamic world. It was the Mongol Empire that first unified China under a single foreign conqueror, setting the stage for the later Ming dynasty and Chinese isolation from the world. Genghis Khan's legacy is complicated and controversial. He was responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people and the destruction of countless cities and civilizations. In this sense, he was a catastrophic figure in human history. But he was also a political and military genius who understood human nature, created institutional systems that lasted centuries, and fundamentally altered the trajectory of human civilization. What makes Genghis Khan's story so remarkable is its trajectory. He was born in poverty, abandoned by his tribe, held captive as a slave, stripped of everything. By any reasonable measure, he should have died forgotten and unknown, another footnote in the endless history of Mongol tribal conflicts. But through a combination of intelligence, courage, ruthlessness, and an almost superhuman determination to overcome adversity, he not only survived but rose to become the most powerful man of his age. The boy who had been lost, literally and figuratively, became the ruler of empires. The powerless became powerful. The humiliated became the humiliator. In a way, Genghis Khan's story is the ultimate underdog story, except that the underdog didn't just overcome his circumstances, he conquered the world. When we think about history's greatest leaders, we often focus on figures like Alexander the Great or Napoleon Bonaparte. These were men of considerable talent and ambition, but they built their empires on foundations that were already substantially laid. Alexander inherited the kingdom of Macedon from his father. Napoleon rose to power in the midst of the French Revolution, when the old order had already been destabilized. But Genghis Khan had no such advantages. He started with nothing, less than nothing, actually, because he started from a position of shame and degradation. This is what makes his story so compelling. He represents the triumph of human will over circumstance, of intelligence over brute strength, of vision over tradition. He showed that one person, regardless of their origins or initial position, could fundamentally reshape the world through a combination of determination, strategic thinking, and a willingness to do whatever it took to achieve his goals. Of course, we must also acknowledge the tremendous cost of his ambitions. The Mongol conquests resulted in the deaths of an estimated 40 million people, perhaps more. Entire civilizations were destroyed. Countless cities were razed. The psychological trauma of the Mongol invasions haunted the peoples of Asia and Eastern Europe for generations afterward. But even when we acknowledge this terrible cost, we cannot deny the historical significance of what Genghis Khan accomplished. He created an empire that connected East and West, that facilitated trade and cultural exchange, that brought a measure of order to the chaotic political landscape of medieval Asia. Whether one judges him as a great man or a terrible one often depends on one's perspective and one's values. For historians and students of military history, Genghis Khan is endlessly fascinating because he represents something almost unprecedented. A political and military leader who rose from literally nothing to reshape an entire world. He was not born a prince or a nobleman. He did not inherit a kingdom or an empire. He built everything himself through sheer force of will and intelligence. In our modern era, we often hear stories about people who overcome adversity and achieve great things. We celebrate entrepreneurs who started with nothing and built billion-dollar companies. We admire politicians who rose from poverty to positions of power. We tell ourselves that if we work hard and have enough determination, we can achieve anything. In many ways, these modern rags-to-riches stories are echoes of the Genghis Khan narrative, though usually on a much smaller scale and with far less destructive consequences. What Genghis Khan understood, perhaps better than any leader before or since, was that power is not something that exists in the external world waiting to be claimed. Power is something that exists in the minds of people, in their beliefs about who is strong, who is capable, who deserves to lead. Once he understood this fundamental truth, Genghis Khan was able to reshape reality itself. When he was a young man, he was weak, but he made himself strong through intelligence and strategic thinking. When he was powerless, he made himself powerful by convincing others that he was worthy of power. When he was despised, he made himself respected through a combination of generosity to his followers and ruthlessness to his enemies. Step by step, he transformed his identity from that of a powerless boy to that of a supreme ruler. The psychological dimension of Genghis Khan's success cannot be overstated. He was a master of understanding what motivated people, what made them loyal, what made them fearful, what made them willing to follow him into battle. He understood that soldiers fight not just for material rewards, but for a sense of purpose and belonging. He created within his army a sense of shared identity and mission. Mongol soldiers were not fighting for the Jin dynasty or for some abstract ruler in a distant capital. They were fighting for Genghis Khan, for the Mongol nation, for the promise of conquest and plunder that he offered them. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of the Genghis Khan story. It's not just about military tactics or strategic planning, though he was brilliant at both. It's about the power of vision, the power of narrative, the power of one person to convince others to follow them into the unknown. Genghis Khan told the Mongol people a story about their destiny. He told them that they were meant to rule the world. He showed them that through unity and determination, they could overcome any obstacle. And then he made it true. In the years after Genghis Khan's death, his empire was divided among his sons and grandsons, eventually fragmenting into the Khanates of the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. These successor states would continue to dominate Asian and Eastern European politics for over a century. But the original spark of the empire, the vision and the will of Genghis Khan himself, gradually faded. His descendants were often talented rulers in their own right, but they lacked the raw hunger and the desperate determination that had driven Genghis Khan himself. This is a common pattern in the history of empires. The founder, driven by the desire to overcome adversity and achieve greatness, builds something magnificent. But the founder's children and grandchildren, inheriting wealth and power that they did not have to earn, often lack the motivation and the psychological intensity that made the founder great. Over time, the empire becomes bureaucratized and calcified, and it eventually succumbs to newer, hungrier powers. This is what happened to the Mongol Empire. Within a century and a half of Genghis Khan's death, the unified Mongol world order had splintered into competing regional powers. The Ming dynasty eventually overthrew the Mongol Yuan dynasty in China. The Ottoman Empire rose to challenge the Mongol-derived Ilkhanate in the Middle East. The Russian states gradually threw off the yoke of Mongol rule from the Golden Horde. But even though the Mongol Empire fragmented and eventually fell apart, the impact of Genghis Khan's conquests continued to reverberate throughout history. The connections that the Mongol Empire had forged between East and West did not disappear when the empire fell apart. The technologies that had been shared and spread across the Mongol Empire, gunpowder weapons, printing technology, mathematical innovations, continued to shape the development of human civilization. Moreover, the very fact that Genghis Khan had shown that such vast conquests were possible inspired later conquerors. Napoleon studied the campaigns of Alexander the Great and was inspired by his ambitions. But had there been no Genghis Khan to demonstrate that an Asian conqueror could build an even larger empire than Alexander, the trajectory of world history might have been different. In popular culture and in the historical imagination, Genghis Khan has become a symbol of ultimate power and ultimate ambition. He is the archetypal conqueror, the figure that other ambitious rulers are compared to. When we want to understand what it looks like for one person to rise from nothing and reshape the world, we look to Genghis Khan. But there is another dimension to his story that is often overlooked. Genghis Khan was not simply a conqueror motivated by the desire for power and domination. He was also a reformer and an administrator. He created legal codes, the Yasa, that applied to all people under Mongol rule, regardless of their ethnic origin or social status. He established a postal relay system that facilitated communication across his vast empire. He encouraged trade and the movement of merchants and ideas. In many ways, Genghis Khan was ahead of his time in his understanding of how to govern a diverse, multi-ethnic empire. He did not insist that all his subjects convert to Mongol religion or adopt Mongol culture. Instead, he allowed local populations to maintain their own religious practices and cultural traditions, as long as they paid their taxes and accepted Mongol political authority. This pragmatic approach to multicultural governance was far more advanced than anything that existed in contemporary Europe or the Islamic world. This is not to say that Genghis Khan was a tolerant or benevolent ruler by modern standards. He was neither, but he was pragmatic, and he understood that the best way to rule a diverse empire was to allow local autonomy in cultural and religious matters, while maintaining strict centralized control over military and political authority. The personal life of Genghis Khan was also far more complex than the image of the distant, all-powerful conqueror might suggest. He was married multiple times and had numerous children. He had favorite wives and concubines, and his children competed fiercely for power and prestige. He had trusted generals and advisors, and he was capable of genuine loyalty to those who served him well. He was also capable of savage revenge against those who betrayed him or challenged his authority. One of his most trusted generals was a man named Gbi, who had originally fought against Genghis Khan before being defeated and incorporated into his service. Gbi proved to be an extraordinarily talented military commander, and Genghis Khan came to rely on him heavily. Gbi led the initial Mongol campaigns against the Khwarezmian Empire and conducted a famous military expedition that took the Mongol armies far to the west, into the Caucasus and southern Russia. Another trusted general was Sabiti, who served Genghis Khan for decades and was responsible for many of the Mongol Empire's greatest military victories. Sabiti was known for his strategic brilliance and his ability to coordinate complex military campaigns across vast distances. He lived longer than most of his contemporaries, serving not only Genghis Khan but also his successors, and he was eventually given a grand funeral befitting his status as one of the greatest military commanders in human history. These men, Gbi, Sabiti, and others like them, were not born into privilege or power. They were warriors who rose through the ranks based on their abilities and their loyalty to Genghis Khan. This is another key to understanding Genghis Khan's success. He created a meritocratic system in which the most talented and capable individuals, regardless of their origins, could rise to the highest positions of power and authority. In our modern era, we often take meritocracy for granted as an ideal, even if we don't always live up to it in practice. But in the 12th and 13th centuries, when hereditary privilege and noble birth were everything, the idea that a talented individual from a humble background could rise to supreme power was genuinely revolutionary. Genghis Khan created a system in which a clever merchant could become a general, or a talented administrator could become a provincial governor, based solely on their demonstrated abilities. This meritocratic approach was one of the key factors that allowed Genghis Khan to consolidate and maintain his power. Rather than being constrained by a rigid class system of hereditary nobility, he could surround himself with the most capable individuals available, regardless of their background. This gave his administration and his military a significant advantage over the hereditary systems of the societies he conquered. As we reflect on the life and legacy of Genghis Khan, we are confronted with a figure who is at once inspiring and deeply troubling. On one hand, he represents the triumph of human will and intelligence over circumstance. He showed that one person, regardless of their origins, could achieve extraordinary things through determination and strategic thinking. On the other hand, he was responsible for the deaths of millions of people and the destruction of countless civilizations. He was a brutal conqueror who showed no mercy to those who resisted him. How do we reconcile these two aspects of his legacy? How do we honor his remarkable achievements while also acknowledging the tremendous human cost of those achievements? One approach is to understand Genghis Khan within his historical context. He was a man of the 13th century, operating according to the moral and ethical standards of his time and place. By the standards of medieval warfare, he was not extraordinarily cruel. If anything, his calculated ruthlessness was more effective and less wasteful than the casual brutality of many other medieval conquerors. He fought to win, and he was willing to do whatever it took to achieve victory. This is what made him effective as a military commander, and this is also what made him terrifying to his enemies. But we should also be cautious about using historical context as an excuse to whitewash or minimize the atrocities committed in Genghis Khan's name. Millions of innocent people died. Entire civilizations were destroyed. Women and children were slaughtered. These are historical facts, and they cannot be erased or minimized simply by placing them in historical context. Perhaps the most honest and balanced approach is to recognize that Genghis Khan was a genuinely remarkable historical figure. A man of tremendous intelligence, will, and vision, who also committed terrible atrocities. We can admire his strategic brilliance and his organizational innovations without endorsing or celebrating the violence and destruction that accompanied his conquests. We can learn from his success without imitating his methods. In many ways, the story of Genghis Khan is a story about the power of human will and determination to overcome adversity and achieve great things. It is a story that resonates across cultures and across centuries because it speaks to something fundamental in the human spirit: the desire to overcome obstacles, to achieve greatness, to leave a mark on the world. But it is also a story about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the terrible costs of conquest. It is a reminder that history is written by the victors, and that the achievements we celebrate often come at the expense of those who are conquered and destroyed. It is a story that challenges us to think deeply about power, ambition, and the kind of world we want to build. The boy who was lost on the Mongol steppes became the greatest conqueror in human history. He rose from poverty and humiliation to rule an empire that stretched across 2 continents. He united people who had never been united before and created a political and military system that lasted for centuries after his death. He transformed the course of world history through sheer force of will and intelligence. And yet, for all his achievements, for all his power and prestige, Genghis Khan died in much the same way as any other mortal man. There is no record of a grand deathbed scene or a ceremonial farewell. He died during a military campaign, far from home, perhaps in pain or illness. His body was returned to Mongolia, but the exact location of his burial is unknown. Even the greatest conqueror in history could not escape the ultimate human fate: death and the dissolution of all earthly power. This is perhaps the ultimate lesson of the Genghis Khan story. For all his power and all his achievements, he was still just a man, subject to the same human limitations and the same inevitable fate as everyone else. His empire outlasted him, but it eventually fragmented and fell. His laws and his institutions were eventually superseded by newer systems. His name lived on in history, but the actual person of Genghis Khan, his thoughts, his feelings, his experiences, is lost to us forever. And yet, the impact of his life continues to echo through history. The connections that the Mongol Empire forged between East and West continued to shape civilization long after the empire itself had fallen. The technologies and ideas that spread across his empire continued to influence human development. The memory of his conquests continued to inspire and terrify people for centuries after his death. In the end, this is how humans achieve a kind of immortality. Not through the prolongation of our individual lives, but through the impact we have on history, on the world, and on the people who come after us. Genghis Khan is dead, but his legacy lives on. The story of Genghis Khan is ultimately a story about transformation. The boy born in poverty and humiliation was transformed into the greatest ruler of his age. The Mongol tribes, scattered and divided, were transformed into a unified nation. The medieval world, divided into isolated and competing powers, was transformed by the arrival of a new force that connected East and West and fundamentally altered the balance of power. And perhaps most importantly, Genghis Khan himself was transformed through the challenges and adversities of his life. The hardship he experienced, the losses he suffered, the humiliations he endured, these were not obstacles to his rise to power, but rather the crucible in which his character was forged. Through adversity, he developed the intelligence, the ruthlessness, and the determination that would eventually allow him to conquer the world. This is a lesson that transcends the specific historical context of 13th century Mongolia. It is a lesson about the power of adversity to shape character, about the possibility of transformation, about the human capacity to overcome the most difficult circumstances and achieve great things. It is a lesson that speaks to people across cultures and across centuries. The story of Genghis Khan reminds us that our circumstances do not determine our destiny. A person can be born into poverty, stripped of everything, humiliated and defeated, and still rise to achieve greatness. It is not the circumstances of our birth that matter, but rather how we respond to those circumstances. It is not the hand that we are dealt, but how we play that hand that determines our fate. Of course, not everyone who overcomes adversity will conquer empires. Genghis Khan's rise to power was extraordinary and remarkable precisely because it was so rare and so unlikely. Most people who face hardship do not go on to reshape world history, but the principle remains true. Adversity can either break us or make us stronger. The choice is often ours. In our modern era, with all our technology and our conveniences, we sometimes forget this fundamental truth about human nature and human potential. We live in societies where our basic needs are generally met, where we have security and comfort, where we don't have to worry about freezing to death or starving. In some ways, this is wonderful. But it also means that we often lack the kind of adversity that forces us to develop our character and our capabilities. Genghis Khan was forced to develop his character through terrible adversity. He was hungry. He was hunted. He was enslaved. He was humiliated. He lost his father, his family's status, his wife to enemies. He had nothing. And yet, through these experiences, he developed the intelligence, the courage, and the determination that would eventually allow him to achieve extraordinary things. This is not to romanticize poverty or suffering. Suffering is terrible, and we should strive to alleviate it wherever we can. But it is to acknowledge that there is a certain wisdom that comes through adversity, a certain strength that is forged through challenge, that is not available to those who have never been tested. The story of Genghis Khan invites us to reflect on our own lives and our own potential. What challenges are we facing? How are we responding to them? Are we letting them break us? Or are we using them as opportunities to develop our character and our capabilities? Are we accepting our circumstances as fixed and unchangeable? Or are we working to transform them? These are the questions that the Genghis Khan story raises for us, and they are questions that each of us must answer for ourselves. As we bring this story to a close, let's reflect on what we have learned. We have learned about a boy born in poverty on the Mongol steppes, a boy who lost his father and was abandoned by his tribe. We have learned about how this boy survived impossible circumstances through courage, intelligence, and determination. We have learned about how he gradually built alliances, defeated rivals, and unified the fractious Mongol tribes under a single banner. We have learned about how he transformed himself from a powerless boy into the most powerful man of his age. We have learned about the military innovations and administrative reforms that allowed him to build and maintain an empire that stretched across 2 continents. We have learned about the terrible cost of his ambitions, the millions of people who died, the cities that were destroyed, the civilizations that were erased from the face of the earth. And finally, we have learned about the enduring legacy of Genghis Khan, the way that his conquests connected East and West, the way that his empire facilitated trade and cultural exchange, the way that his impact on history continues to reverberate centuries after his death. The story of Genghis Khan is ultimately a story about the power of human will and determination. It is a story about the possibility of transformation, about the capacity of human beings to overcome adversity and achieve greatness, about the way that one person can fundamentally alter the course of history. It is a story that challenges us, inspires us, and makes us think deeply about power, ambition, leadership, and the kind of world we want to build. And it is a story that, nearly 800 years after the death of its protagonist, continues to captivate our imagination and shape our understanding of what is possible. The lost boy from the Mongol steppes became the greatest conqueror in human history. He showed us that our origins do not determine our destiny, that adversity can forge us into something stronger, and that one person with enough determination and intelligence can reshape the world. His empire is long gone. His descendants no longer rule, but the memory of Genghis Khan lives on, a testament to the extraordinary potential of human will and human ambition. And that, perhaps, is the greatest victory of all. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time, for following the remarkable story of a lost boy who became history's greatest Khan. The story of Genghis Khan reminds us that history is not made by fate or circumstance, but by the choices and the determination of remarkable individuals. If you enjoyed this tale of history's greatest conqueror, please like and subscribe to History Bedtime Stories for more captivating stories from the past. Drop a comment below and let me know, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? I read every comment and love connecting with our global audience. Until next time, thank you for being here with me on History Bedtime Stories. Sleep well and dream of the vast, windswept plains of Mongolia, where history's greatest conqueror was born. Good night.